After the release of Metal Gear Acid, Konami was clearly happy with how it performed. Despite some extensive searching, I wasn't able to find much of anything in regards to the development process of Acid 2 or the sales of the first game, but someone at the company clearly liked the idea of a sequel, as the team would quickly get to work on one, with Acid 2 releasing only a year after the original. But the real question is, with such a short development, were they really able to expand and improve upon the gameplay? And how would the game follow up on the original's absolutely insane story? Well, let's talk about it. And before getting too far into the video, I should mention that this is the 10th in a series of videos where I'm playing every Metal Gear game for the first time and reviewing them as I go along in preparation for Metal Gear Delta. And while you don't have to have seen the rest of the videos in order to enjoy this one, you will be missing a lot of important context about my journey with the series if you haven't seen them. So I'll have the full playlist linked in the description below for those of you that want to check those out first. But with that out of the way, Metal Gear Acid 2 is a turn-based collectible card stealth game developed by Kojima Productions and published by Konami for the PlayStation Portable in 2005. And right off the bat, I should mention that the game does let you transfer your data from Acid 1 over when starting a new game, allowing you to bring over a bunch of credits and a couple of cards from your save file, but I personally decided not to for the sake of this review, just to make sure that the game's progression and balance would still hold up for players who never played the original game. Hopping right in though, the game opens with a quick tutorial section to cover the basics, and here I was immediately caught off guard by the new art style of the game. Acid 1 didn't necessarily look bad for its time, but it definitely looked like an early PSP game. Acid 2's models and assets don't have a much higher fidelity, in fact a lot of them are reused throughout the game, but the game uses a much more bright and colorful art style along with cel shading on the character and enemy models, leading to a much more visually appealing style overall. And in terms of the core gameplay, it's pretty much unchanged from the original game. You've got various cards that all have specific abilities and uses. You can burn any card in your hand for a small amount of movement. The cost system still determines when characters are able to take their turn, and you still get scored at the end of every mission, with bonuses available for things like completing the level quickly, not being spotted, or not killing any enemies. And if you're not already familiar with the basic gameplay of the Metal Gear Acid games, then I highly recommend that you check out my video on the first game, as I already dug really deep into the gameplay and how things work in that video, and I don't want to repeat myself here. Also during this tutorial, I was pleasantly surprised to see that the movement controls have been tweaked a bit to feel smoother overall. Instead of selecting what tile you want to move to before selecting what direction you want to be facing when you stop moving, you can now see Snake move across the tiles with every input, making it feel more like you're actively controlling him rather than telling him what to do. Along with this, if you want to change the direction he's facing, you can simply hold the square button and press a direction on the D-pad and Snake will turn to face in that direction. And probably the best change to movement here is that instead of climbing or descending ladders instantly ending your movement, you can now smoothly climb or descend a ladder and continue to move afterwards, meaning you won't have your turn abruptly ended just because you met a ladder the way you did in the first game. And the camera here has also improved a lot, with it dynamically moving to make sure that things are always clearly visible no matter what direction it's facing. If a wall is getting in the way, the camera will move itself to be directly above Snake just to make sure that you don't get those weird angles from Acid 1 where you're literally just staring at a wall. It's not a perfect improvement, and every once in a while you'll find a location where it doesn't seem to know that it should move to avoid the angle getting blocked, but it works 9 times out of 10, and it's a massive improvement from how frequently this was a problem in the previous title. Once we finish up with the tutorial though, the game properly introduces us to the story. We open with returning protagonist Solid Snake sitting in the back of a plane, and a girl named Consuela who's sitting with him asks if he had that dream again. Snake tells her that he did, and the others on the plane mention that we're close to the land of the free, and that Escobar likely won't be willing to chase us there after we destroyed his drug factory and apparently took $15 million from him. They're all talking about their dreams for once they get to America, with Snake saying that his is to get his memory back, revealing to us that it was apparently lost about 3 years ago. When we land, we're met with an FBI agent named Dalton who puts us under arrest for the murder of the Secretary of State of the Serena Republic, the country that we just flew in from. We get interrogated by Dalton, with Snake telling him that he didn't kill the Secretary of State and that it was actually Escobar who's trying to frame them for it. Dalton explains that the government of the Serena Republic has issued a formal demand to have Snake and the other 3 sent back and locked up, and that Escobar must be bribing them to get Snake back for some reason. He offers us a deal, saying that he won't deport any of us back if we manage to pull off a job for him. And so, being stuck between a rock and a hard place, Snake accepts the mission, and we're brought to a facility owned by the Saint Logic Corporation, a private arms manufacturer. Dalton tells us that we're being sent in to retrieve some files for an ongoing investigation of his, while he oversees the operation from a boat docked at the edge of the island. Once we arrive, we get to see the menus for the first time, including things like the deck editor. And even though I hadn't earned any new cards yet, I decided to take a quick peek at the editor, and I saw there that there are a total of 565 cards in this game. And if you don't remember the exact card count from Acid 1, it was 204, meaning that there are almost 3 times the amount of unique cards here in Acid 2. That's an insane amount of build variety available for your decks, and that's before we even factor in the addition of card upgrades. In Acid 2, you're able to use some of the credits you earn in missions to upgrade cards that you already have, which can do a variety of things from reduce the cost of the card, enhance the effect of it, or even just completely change the card in some cases. So not only are there now 565 cards, but every single one of those cards can be upgraded into something entirely new, meaning that there's actually over 1,100 unique cards available for you to build your decks with in this game. So if you're someone who enjoyed the deck building and the sheer variety available in Acid 1, then you are going to absolutely adore Acid 2. But before we really get to dig into all that, we need to find those files for Dalton, and as we move through the facility, we eventually find the computer that has what he's looking for. He mentions that the files we're looking for contain info on children, but that he doesn't have time to explain it to us right now. And if I wasn't being threatened with deportation, I would probably call the authorities after hearing that. Just after finding them though, the alarm suddenly goes off and the facility is put on lockdown. Dalton asks if we were seen, and Snake says that we weren't, and that something must be going on somewhere else in the facility. Dalton tells us to go to the communications tower and upload the files to him before the interference causes us to lose radio contact with him. While on the way there, I also noticed a pretty big change to the core gameplay here. When sneaking around, firing unsuppressed weapons will actually attract nearby guards now. If you haven't seen my video on the first game, you might be thinking, well yeah, no shit, but this actually really surprised me since the first game allowed you to fire an assault rifle 5 feet away from a guard and not have him suspect a thing. It adds an extra layer to the stealth gameplay that admittedly should have been there in the first place, but that doesn't mean that the addition of it here isn't a definitive improvement over the original. Anyway, we eventually get to the communications tower, re-establishing contact with Dalton, but as we do, some men arrive on his boat, with one of them introducing himself as Joseph Wiseman, who explains that he's working for the US Department of Defense. He refers to Dalton as ex-Agent Dalton before explaining to us that there's been a serious incident within the Saint Logic building. He tells us that Thomas Koppelthorn, Saint Logic's vice president and head of research, has taken over the internal weapons and security systems and closed himself into the hangar in the facility. He's demanding that the US government hand over a dozen high-ranking military men, corporate executives, and government officials, and that if they don't comply, he's threatening to fire a nuclear weapon. He reveals that Saint Logic was working with the government to develop a new type of nuclear strike system, which, of course, turns out to be a new Metal Gear. He explains that they can't just send in a full armed force due to the threat of nuclear weapons, but they can't send someone in to infiltrate the facility either due to the lockdown, and that since we already happen to be in there, he needs us to help him clean up the incident. He then reveals to Snake that he knows all about his past, and that if we complete the mission for him, he'll explain everything we want to know, including how we lost our memory. So naturally, we agree to work with him for the time being, and we head off to find Koppelthorn and figure out why he took over the facility. Moving forward, we get a call from a mysterious voice calling themselves BB. They tell us that they're a hacker extraordinaire, that they've been listening to our communications the entire time, and that they've even made some card packs for us to buy in the shop. They say that they're helping us because they think that what we do is really cool, before logging back off to go eat some food.
Right.
We continue on, eventually reaching the research building, and when we get there, we're met with the bodies of dead researchers everywhere. Wiseman explains that Koppelthorn must have used the facility's security bots to carry this out before the soldier with him says that he's getting a call from Aphrodite and he needs to step away for a moment. We ask Dalton about his investigation, and he reveals that 2 years prior, he began looking into allegations that Saint Logic was conducting illegal experiments on human subjects. He doesn't know exactly what happened, but he heard whispers that children were being smuggled in from South America and Africa as subjects for the research. And shortly after he made this discovery, he was abruptly ordered to drop the case. He believes that the president of Saint Logic was likely using his government connections to cover things up, which angered him greatly, and when he spoke out about it, he was fired from the FBI. Moving through the research building, we come across a female researcher and a child who are startled by us, saying that we've come here to kill them before locking a gate in front of us and running away. Wiseman confirms that the woman is Michiko Takayama, a researcher for Saint Logic with a graduate's degree in psychological engineering. We find our way around the shutter to catch up with her, and we ask her what's gotten into Koppelthorn before she explains that he wanted to run some new experiment, but that the Saint Logic president was strongly opposed to it and tried to put a stop to the whole thing. She doesn't know what kind of experiment it was, and tells us that he was working on it entirely alone. We tell them to stay put and hide if any guards come in before we go off to find Koppelthorn. And on the way there, it really clicked with me that with the massive amount of new cards, I found that stealth felt a lot better here thanks to all the new options available. I mentioned earlier that you now have to pay attention to whether your weapons are suppressed or not, but they've also added so many new cards here that allow you to silently take down guards. Or they were just some of the many cards that I never managed to collect in the first game, which is entirely possible given just how large these games actually are. Point is, I found that the stealth felt a lot more satisfying to plan and execute in this game than in the first, so if you didn't love the stealth in the first game, you'll likely get a lot more mileage out of it here. And as we're sneaking around, we come across this giant ogre, ape, Frankenstein subject named Harab Serap, who tells us that the birth of the queen is coming soon before a boss fight begins. There's nothing all that unique here aside from the boss's design and animations, as we basically just run around in the room trading damage back and forth until one of us dies. That being said, it is a good test of whether or not you can manage your cost and your health well enough to progress further into the game, so as an introductory boss fight / skill check, it gets the job done well enough. After we defeat him, a woman drops down from the ceiling, saying that she's been looking all over for us and introducing herself as Venus. She explains that she's working with Wiseman and that she had infiltrated the facility to clean up the Koppelthorn mess, but once it was discovered that Snake was here, they decided that she would run support for him instead. And while it's never stated outright, Venus is likely the Aphrodite that we heard calling Wiseman earlier, as Aphrodite and Venus are the names of the goddesses of love in Greek and Roman mythology respectively. We leave with her, and immediately after, a large masked man storms in with his guards, saying that they need to secure Metal Gear and eliminate the test subjects, as well as find the intruders who are running around the facility. From this point on, Venus pretty much works exactly how Teleco did in the first game. We control her alongside Snake in every mission, she has her own card deck that's separate from Snake's, and she fills the role of a female lead, being introduced about a third of the way into the game. One thing that is new though is the addition of what I'm calling combo shots, where you can have Snake and Venus surround an enemy, and if one of your characters shoots at them, the other will also use an equipped weapon to fire their own shots at the enemy, effectively doubling the firepower available during your turn. And these combo shots don't use any extra cost, so setting them up can be incredibly beneficial if you find yourself fighting an enemy with a ton of health. Snake and Venus go back to find Takayama, but when we get there, she's gone, and the large man from earlier reveals himself to them. He introduces himself as Vince, Saint Logic's head of security, before we get a boss fight against him. He has some crazy abilities like being able to pick up and throw explosive containers from around the room, but aside from that, he's essentially just a big damage sponge just like the last guy. After we've defeated him, he tells us that Takayama is in charge of the ego system, which he assumes is what we're here for. He also tells us that Takayama was already gone when they arrived before the alarms in the place start blaring and the computer system announces that a test sequence has been initiated. Vince says that Koppelthorn must have fired up Metal Gear before he suddenly jumps up and runs away. We go to find Takayama, eventually finding her and the child subject cornered by about 15 security bots. We clear them out, confronting her about the ego system and asking what it is. She explains that it's a new operating system for Metal Gear, that the test announced by the system a few minutes ago was in fact for Metal Gear, and that its development is already complete and it's totally ready to fire at a moment's notice. Wiseman then asks her about something called the Lucinda file, with her confirming that Koppelthorn did have something to do with it before quickly moving on from the subject. Dalton then goes to the bathroom to call BB, asking them to look into the ego system for him. While we wait for the train system to bring us to another part of the facility, Dalton asks Takayama about the kid. She tells him that her name is Lucy and that she doesn't talk much because she's only aware of her surroundings for about 3 hours a day, saying that she's only been given a fragmented ego. BB then calls Dalton, saying that they managed to dig up some files on Wiseman that mention that he's part of some special weapons development program. Venus then randomly asks Snake if he would like to go on a date once all of this is over, saying that the two of them are alike because Wiseman promised them the exact same thing. Snake asks her if she lost her memory too, with her saying that she never actually had a memory to begin with, but she gets cut off by the arrival of the train. And while we're on the topic of the train, we should definitely talk about how much better the level gimmicks and variety are here compared to Acid 1. The first game had a couple of fun gimmicks, but Acid 2 does a lot more to shake things up. The low-light levels from the original game make a return, we get a battle on top of the train while we're riding it, there's one mission where you're at risk of instant death if enemies knock you off the small walkways you're on, and there's a considerably higher amount of bosses throughout the campaign as well. There are a lot of unique levels and gimmicks in Acid 2 that weren't in the original, and it really makes the game feel much better in the pacing department than the first ever did. And while we're riding the train, we get brought to an abrupt stop, getting our first look at Metal Gear. It's much more colorful than I would have expected, but overall, it's a really good looking Metal Gear design. Koppelthorn calls out to Takayama, thanking her for bringing Lucy back to him. He reveals that Lucy had wandered out of his lab, so he sent Takayama out to find her and bring her back to him, before Takayama asks him if he's actually going through with the experiment. He tells her that he is, and Takayama is reluctant, but she ends up going with him, bringing Lucy along with her. He then tells us to relay a message to the president to gather up everyone on the list involved with the incident 3 years ago and have them delivered to him within 2 hours, or he'll fire the warhead from Metal Gear. He then sees Snake climb out of the train, which catches him by surprise with him saying that he's supposed to be dead. Vince then shows up with a large number of tanks, telling Koppelthorn to turn himself in before Koppelthorn uses Metal Gear to wipe them all out with ease. He turns back to us, saying that he's adding Snake to the list of individuals he's demanding before destroying the bridge between us so that we can't get to him. We go to find the St. Logic president to ask how to get across the ravine, with him telling us that there's a secondary bridge that we can get to by using the sewers. We then ask why Koppelthorn is doing all this, with him saying that he's not quite sure and that he's just been acting like a madman since the incident 3 years ago. He mentions that the International Criminal Court was going to conduct an investigation on Koppelthorn, but that he had to negotiate a deal with them so that he and the company wouldn't go down with him. He needed to give them something called the Lucinda file as part of the deal, but Koppelthorn said that he needed it for his experiments and refused to give it up, so the president ordered security to kill him, which sparked the whole disaster that we find ourselves in now. Venus then asks him why Snake would be on the list of demands, with the president telling us that Snake is the one that killed Koppelthorn's wife. And upon hearing this, I started to wonder if this was where Acid 2's story would finally tie itself back to the previous game, and Koppelthorn's wife was somehow involved with the incident on Libido Island. As we're moving forward, we get another call from BB, who says that they found some info on Koppelthorn's wife, Lucinda Koppelthorn. They tell us that Lucinda seems to have been a researcher at the facility, but almost all of her records and files have since been deleted. And a little bit further into the facility, we come across the metal gear from Acid 1 being stored in a hangar, giving us our first official confirmation that this is a direct sequel to the first game. Shortly after, we run into a man named Golub who tells us that Koppelthorn told him to bring Snake in alive, but he wants to cremate Snake in honor of the Queen's birth. And during this conversation, it clicked for me what he and the subject from earlier meant about the Queen's birth, but we'll save that for later just so that I don't ruin the surprise for everyone. We get a boss fight with him where he does some pretty insane stuff like setting himself on fire or drinking fuel to spew flames at us from his mouth, almost feeling like a reimagining of Pyro Bison from Ghost Babel. This is the first truly unique boss in the game, and as you'll see later in the video, the personality of these bosses will only become more and more extreme as the game goes on. When we defeat him, he tells us that the time has come to get revenge on the ones who made them what they are, before breathing fire around the room to set off the explosives in there, forcing us to flee before the entire building comes down on top of us. As we're escaping though, we get locked into the Metal Gear hangar, and the old Metal Gear is activated, leading to a rematch with the previous game's final boss. And this fight is actually a little bit improved thanks to the removal of that awkward part with Teleco being inside of Metal Gear, and instead just having both of your characters outside teaming up against it. There's also a hard time limit on the fight, as if we don't manage to defeat Metal Gear in less than 300 cost, the building will collapse and will be killed in the explosion. It's not a fight that's central to the story or anything, but it is an admittedly fun addition for those of us that played the original game. We eventually reach the hangar that Koppelthorn is hiding out in, and BB calls to tell us that they found some info on the Ego system. They explain to us that the program went through multiple stages of development. The first version was called the Program and was a pretty basic operating system for Metal Gear to run on. They then wrote something they referred to as neuron-level simulation of human cognition, where they pulled over the original code, but also gave it human thought, reflexes, and more, naming this version the Duplicate. The Duplicate allowed them to copy the human mind into a computer program, and it was all written by Dr. Koppelthorn. BB then explains to us that the Duplicate is capable of deleting memories from the human mind and causing abnormalities, and that's what led to the test subjects that we saw earlier. They also say that they found out there's a third revision of the operating system, but they don't have any info on it just yet, so they tell us that they'll call us back later. Along the way, we run into Chigadil, another test subject from the Duplicate. He tells us that he'll explain what the fertilization is if we can defeat him before we get yet another boss fight. Chigadil runs around on the ceiling of the arena, throwing down landmines and attempting to hypnotize us throughout the fight. If Snake or Venus are hypnotized, the player will lose control of them, and the game's AI will attempt to kill the other partner using the card deck that you've put together for them. And halfway through the fight, he even kills the lights in the arena, adding low visibility to the list of things that you need to deal with. This is easily the best fight in either of the Acid games up to this point, and it would have been my favorite in the game if it wasn't for another one that we'll be getting back to soon. Once we manage to defeat him, he tells us that Lucinda Koppelthorn has been reborn. He explains that years ago, when Lucinda was dying, Koppelthorn immediately removed her brain from her body in order to extract her consciousness and implanted it into a test subject's body. He explains that the standard test subjects from the Duplicate were inadequate though, so Koppelthorn was buying and smuggling in children from other countries to find the perfect host for Lucinda, which just so happens to be what Dalton was looking into in the beginning of the game. Chigadil says that they eventually found the perfect subject and gave them Lucinda's name, revealing that the girl Lucy from earlier is in fact the reborn Lucinda Koppelthorn. He tells Snake to go and bow before the queen, as it's his queen just as much as it is theirs, something that definitely piqued my curiosity before finally bleeding out. Just after this, Wiseman gets called out again before BB calls Dalton, saying that they found out where Lucinda Koppelthorn died. He reveals that she died in the Serena Republic, the same country that Snake was fleeing from at the start of the game. 3 years prior, there was an attempted ethnic cleansing in the country known as the Prowlia Massacre, and while he doesn't have any concrete evidence, the timelines just line up too perfectly for her not to have been caught up in it. He explains that every last bit of her research into the operating system before she died was all gathered up and compiled into the Lucinda file by Saint Logic, and that Wiseman is likely trying to get his hands on it so they can use it in the US military. Snake is left wondering if he might have actually taken part in the Prowlia massacre before losing his memory shortly after, but Dalton tells him not to worry about that for now and to keep going. Moving further in, we come across Vince again, and Venus threatens him with a good time before we get another boss fight against him. And it's really just a repeat of the first fight, only now he has a bunch of guards to back him up as well. After we defeat him, he gets a call from his forces saying that the St. Logic president is escaping the island in a helicopter. The president explains to Vince that his deal with the ICC fell through, and now they're going to investigate him no matter what he does, so he's leaving the mess in Vince's hands now. The guards ask Vince what to do, and he tells them to shoot him down and then retreat from the island. He then tells us that Metal Gear and Koppelthorn are just ahead, and that his guards will let us through before finally bleeding out. BB then calls Dalton and Snake, saying that he found out that St. Logic has connections within the Serena Republic. 3 years ago, St. Logic held a field test using the subjects from the duplicate, but they were highly unstable at the time, and when St. Logic failed to maintain control of them, they went into a violent rage, leading to the Prowlia massacre. He explains that the Lucinda file would contain everything they need to bring this incident to the public, and that the real reason Wiseman must be looking for it is to cover up the whole incident in Serena for all the politicians and corporate executives involved. Dalton tells him to try to get this information over to the Secretary of Defense before BB logs off to focus on doing so. We move further into the hangar, running into Koppelthorn and Lucy in the new Metal Gear. Koppelthorn explains to Snake that he really did kill Lucinda, as he was sent in along with other Model 3 test subjects to take out the rampaging duplicate subjects in Serena 3 years ago. Lucy then reveals that Snake was actually a subject of theirs created through cloning the legendary Solid Snake, whose body was recovered from Libido Island years ago. And this is a point where I should clarify that these games are completely non-canon to the main Metal Gear timeline. I got a bunch of comments on the Acid 1 video saying that the games actually are canon, as it's revealed in this game that Snake is actually a clone of Solid Snake from the mainline games, but that's just blatantly wrong, as they say here that he's a clone of the Solid Snake whose body was recovered from Libido Island years ago, meaning that if it was the same Snake, he died well before the events of Metal Gear Solid 4. When he was sent into Serena, he cleared out the test subjects, but he also tried to escape and go free, killing Lucinda in the process. Snake tells him that being killed by a maniac isn't part of his plans, and we get a boss fight against the new Metal Gear. It's basically just a giant damage sponge, but what's actually really cool is that it uses only cards that the player themselves can earn, and has a unique animation for every single card in its deck. That being said though, it's definitely the most frustrating boss in the game, having the ability to just instantly kill one of your characters by walking over them. That might not sound so bad to a lot of you, but because of how the card system works, it can just randomly decide to walk around on any given turn regardless of what cards are in its hand, meaning that it happens completely at random, leading to an insane amount of unforeseeable and instant deaths. After we finally deal enough damage to it though, Koppelthorn and Lucy decide to activate the Ego system, which will allow her to control Metal Gear and bring out its full potential by merging her consciousness with it. But as Koppelthorn attempts to activate it, the process fails, and Lucy reveals that she isn't actually Lucinda, but was only pretending to be. She explains that when they wiped her memory and personality to try to implant Lucinda's, her brain gave birth to a new personality, a new consciousness in its place, and she pretended to be Lucinda because she knew that they'd kill her if she was a failure. Lucinda was placed into her mind, but she became just another voice within Lucy's body rather than being a reborn version of herself as expected. Lucy then tells Koppelthorn that Snake didn't actually kill his wife, but that Lucinda actually helped Snake escape after realizing how horrible their work was when seeing the test subjects in action. And as a result for helping Snake escape, the St. Logic forces in the country actually killed her. Lucy then uses the Ego system to eject the cockpit that Koppelthorn is sitting in, blasting him with a missile while he's midair. She then explains to us that she actually tricked Koppelthorn into making all those demands and threats while pretending to be his dead wife so that she could take over the Metal Gear and activate the Ego system. She explains that the nanochips she was implanted with were originally made to control Metal Gear, so she always had the urge to return to it, seeing it as her real body. She plans to escape from the facility, taking the other test subjects with her, offering for Snake to come along. Snake turns her down, leading us into the second phase of the Metal Gear fight. And despite the story implications, this is essentially just the first phase of the fight repeated with a couple of new attacks added, just requiring us to chew through Metal Gear's health bar a second time, while still avoiding the instant deaths from getting stomped on. It took me about an hour to get through the first phase of the fight for the first time, but with this effectively doubled health bar, beating the entire Metal Gear fight took me nearly 3 hours, and I'm genuinely not exaggerating when I tell you that every single one of those deaths came from getting stomped on by Metal Gear. We eventually destroy Metal Gear though, with Lucy telling us that Takayama and the Lucinda file are in the next room over before dying on the floor of the hangar. We go and find Takayama before Venus draws her gun on us, saying that she needs to clean up everyone who knows the link between the Lucinda file and the Prowlia massacre. She reveals that Wiseman was the one responsible for the massacre, with him explaining that he was the man in charge of the military program that was trying to use the test subjects from the duplicate. He ordered Lucinda Koppelthorn to provoke the subjects into a blind rage in order to gather more thorough test data on them, and if anyone manages to get their hands on the Lucinda file, they'll know that he caused the massacre knowingly. They originally were going to have Venus infiltrate the facility alone and retrieve the file, while blaming the entire incident on Dalton and Snake since they also happened to be there at the same time, but when Koppelthorn started issuing threats, it forced them to improvise. He also reveals that Venus is another Model 3 test subject just like Snake, and that he just got word from the Secretary of Defense that they know about BB and how he's been hacking into their systems, so they've sent out troops to handle that problem as well. Venus says that we can't beat her, with Wiseman explaining that she was the one who tracked us down after we escaped and shot us, leading to our memory loss. We get a boss fight against Venus, which is easily the best in the game if you ask me. She uses the exact same deck as Snake during this fight in an attempt to make it fair, which means that whatever tactics and overpowered cards you might be using to beat her, she will also use to beat you. If you bring a weapon that deals 300 damage per shot, she's going to fire it right back at you. If you stock up on a ton of healing items to try to outlast her, she'll be healing just as often as you are. It's a true mirror match, and it's one that was incredibly satisfying to try to outsmart and beat the AI on. After we defeat Venus, Wiseman tells us not to kill her, threatening us with Dalton's life. But just then, the boat they're on is raided by the Department of Defense, all thanks to BB exposing Wiseman to the President of the United States himself. Dalton informs us that the self-destruct sequence in the hangar has been initiated, so we need to escape with Venus and Takayama, and fast. We go through the escape route before a shutter suddenly drops between Snake and the other two, separating them for the time being. Snake has to find another way around, but Takayama and Venus come across a jeep, using it to make their escape. After they make it out, it seems like they've finally escaped, but then Metal Gear suddenly appears on the roof of the building. The military blasts it with their tanks, seemingly destroying it, but as it crumples, it fires something off into the ocean. We get one last scene with Takayama and Venus talking about Snake, with Venus saying that she's sure that he made it out somehow, and the credits roll. We then of course get a post-credits scene, because this is a Metal Gear game, with Snake and Dalton talking to each other, revealing that it was Snake controlling Metal Gear at the end, and that he launched himself into the ocean using the linear cannon before Dalton came around in the boat to pick him up. He tells us that the Lucinda file was made public, and everyone who was tied up in the incident is now going to trial, starting with Wiseman. Dalton gives Snake back his passport, ID, and the $15 million, telling him to go off and start his new life, before his crew from the beginning of the game also comes in to be reunited with him. Overall, I really enjoyed the story of Acid 2 for what it was. The biggest thing to point out here is that it absolutely addressed Acid 1's issue where it tried to cram the answer to every question throughout the game into one final cutscene, and it did a much better job of actually answering questions as the game's story went on, making it a lot easier to keep up with. They didn't hold back on the mystery aspect that made the first game's story feel so unique, they just properly paced things out so that it wasn't as overly confusing. However, as a follow-up to the original story, it feels a little disappointing. There were so many questions left unanswered at the end of Acid 1, like what is number 104 going to do next, or how is Charles going to try to capture Snake and what does he plan to do once he has him, or who are the members of Emilio? And I mentioned it earlier, but how the hell did Snake die in the first game? We see him at the end of the game talking with Teleco and saying that they're gonna go climb a mountain, and then near the end of Acid 2, they just reveal that he somehow died on Libido Island, but we never get any details about what actually happened. All up though, I think that Acid 2 is a solid improvement over the original. This video might have felt a little light on the gameplay discussion, but that's because so much of Acid 1's gameplay was left unchanged, aside from the small improvements that were made throughout. It doesn't blow the game away by any means, but it's just packed to the brim with little improvements throughout the entire game. It's a more well-paced experience, and it expands the deck customization by an insane amount, and I doubt there are many people out there that prefer the original Acid to this one. If you enjoyed the first game, you'll enjoy this one even more, but if you weren't able to get into it, Acid 2 likely won't be the one to change your mind. So at the end of the day, I'm going to give Metal Gear Acid 2 an 8 out of 10. Hey guys, thanks for stopping by. If you liked this video, check on screen for more entries in the series, and feel free to subscribe if you like my work. If you find yourself falling in love with this stuff, maybe check out my Patreon and join the amazing group that makes these videos all possible. Thanks guys, and I'll see you right here for the next Metal Gear review.